Thank you all for coming out today. I'm William Strollo. I'm the Curator of Exhibitions here at the DAR, and I will be presenting today's lecture. If you are interested in any other upcoming events, lectures, and programs, there are little flyers in the back. Feel free to grab one of those on your way out. Our next Tuesday talk appears to be on July 9th. That's Arts and Sciences in the 19th Century Quilt. So it's a great lecture to go along with our current exhibition, which is downstairs, and it focuses on the role of women in quilting in society. So also, I recommend checking that out. Yes?
You want the lights out?
No, lights are good.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's begin. There we go. My interest in this subject came one summer when I was spending a month studying at the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I spent the whole month learning about the Carolina and Georgia Low Country and its material culture in order to better understand one object. For me, that one object was a tea-board. This 1775 mahogany tea-board made in the Charleston Cabinetmaking shop of Thomas Elf belonged to Elias Ball II. I learned a lot about the tea-board, Thomas Elf, the Ball family, and many other things in researching for this piece. In fact, I was able to trace this piece from the day it was sold to the Ball family, and that is September 2nd, 1775, through generations of ownership all the way to Mesda's acquisition of the piece. Even more significant is that this piece is the first that can be traced back to Thomas Elf's 1768 to 75 account book. But what was interesting to me was Elf's use of enslaved labor in his cabinet-making shop. In combing through object files and studying the development of the Charleston Low Country, it became more evident that there was more to the creation of a piece than just the master of a certain shop. So today I'm going to talk about the use of enslaved labor, or use of enslaved craftsmen in Charleston cabinet-making shops, their training and regulation, and how there came to be demand for this labor force. By the time of the American Revolution, Charleston stood alone as the wealthiest city in British North America. Relative to other British cities in North America, Charleston was a cosmopolitan epicenter. Driven by the growth and popularity of southern cash crops of rice and indigo, Charleston plantation owners gained tremendous wealth that they then in turn spent emulating British elite. During Josiah Quincy's 1773 travel to the Low Country, the Massachusetts native recounted his interaction with many of the region's eminent figures, including Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and Miles Bruton. His journal details his interactions with these individuals, the places he toured, and the conversations held around dinner. In his entry for March 3rd, 1773, he recounts, "In loftiness of headdress, these ladies stoop to the daughters of the North. In richness of dress surpass them. The gentlemen, many of them dressed with richness and elegance was common with us. Many with swords on. We had 2 macaronis present, just arrived from London." Quincy's description of the elite ladies and gentlemen he met in Charleston is a typical image we think of when picturing colonial Charleston society at its peak. American artist Benjamin West's 1770 portrait of the Middleton family best exemplifies visually what it meant to be elite in 18th century Charleston. At the left-hand third of this portrait stands Arthur Middleton, signer of the Declaration of Independence and wealthy landowner in Charleston's Low Country. The patriarch is comfortably reaching toward the center of the portrait in order to grasp the outstretched arm of his newborn son, Henry. Holding Henry, in the right-hand third of the portrait, is Arthur's wife, Mary Izard Middleton. Mary is seated on a sofa and looks toward Arthur, with Henry grabbing the collar of her robe. The setting appears to be indoors, with fine tapestry hanging in the walls in front of the classical stone column. Henry is seated in his mother's lap while she is seated on a fine green sofa. None of the furnishings are simple, commonplace items. Rather, they are expensive goods that overtly convey an understanding of the family's wealth and status, a perception that the Middletons desired to achieve while in London to take back to Charleston with them. The Middleton family portrait epitomizes the desire and perception and ambition of Charleston planter elite and of those who sought to be the upper echelons of society. Charlestonians saw themselves as English citizens merely removed from the mother country and created a society within the Low Country that resembled that which they witnessed in England. To financially distinguish themselves, some Charlestonians looked to large agricultural production. Rice production was particularly lucrative. Between 1760 and 1770 alone, more than 587 million pounds of rice was exported from the Carolinas. With such success, Low Country planter elite built large country estates and purchased lots in Charleston for lavish urban residence. Elias Ball II was the heir to a family fortune dating back to 1682, which was established in rice and timber cultivation. In Elias's 1784 last will and testament, he divided his property among his 3 surviving children, Elias III, John, and Lydia. The eldest son, Elias III, received Cummington and Limerick plantations in St. John's Parish. John received Kensington, Hyde Park, and Savoy plantations in St. John's Parish. Lydia received his, quote, lot of land situated on the Bay of Charleston. Elias's sons managed their portion of the inheritance so well that they each added to their land holdings by the end of the century. Such successful management led to enormous wealth, which resulted in more outward displays of status mirroring British aristocracy. Their economic success was due in part to the use of enslaved labor throughout the 18th century. As production demands and profits increased, so too did labor demands. The total enslaved population in South Carolina in 1700 is estimated to be approximately 2,400 individuals. By 1740, the enslaved population boomed and surpassed the white population for the first time. The total enslaved population as of 1740 is estimated to be approximately 39,000 enslaved individuals. By the end of the century, the total population for South Carolina reached, enslaved population for South Carolina reached 146,000. So as income increased, so too did the desire for goods. While the Low Country elite preferred English goods as their first choice, Charleston cabinet makers were ready to compete for their business. I don't think it was quite this aggressive. You get the idea. Yeah. Shop owners advertised regularly that they produced goods in the latest styles from London, or that they themselves or someone in their shop was lately arrived from London. This signaled that modern fashionable goods could be procured closer to home and at a more affordable cost. Numerous advertisements for fashionable goods can be found in the South Carolina Gazette and other such newspapers from the late 18th century, such as this South Carolina Gazette ad from December 12, 1761, which reads, "Peter Hall, cabinet maker from London, where gentlemen and ladies of taste may have made and be supplied with Chinese tables of all sorts, being at present the most elegant and admired fashion in London." Charleston cabinet makers sought to take advantage of the elite's desire to be as English as possible, despite being an ocean away. Charleston businessmen used their training and contacts in England in order to compete with English counterparts. Richard McGrath, a London-trained cabinet maker in Charleston, made sure that the people of the city knew that they would receive the finest quality English goods from his shop when he advertised in 1767 of his intention to, quote, quit the province for a few months early in the spring and to go to England in order to engage some experienced workmen who will enable him to turn out work not in the least inferior to the first cabinet shop in London. McGrath reiterated his direct association with England when he advertised again in 1771 that he was lately from London. And he didn't stop there, stating that, quote, from his connections in London, he will always be supplied with the newest fashions, underscoring the appetite for English goods in the South Carolina Low Country. This further underscores the fact that Charleston elites were willing to pay for the finest goods, and that the top competition was London, hands down. Further examination of archival records reveals that cabinet makers did more than just advertise that they had quality goods at a reasonable rate. They were finding ways to cut costs and fill orders so as to compete with London. Take for example Thomas Elf, who used enslaved craftsmen in his shop. At the time of Elf's death, he owned and listed 9 enslaved craftsmen in his account book. Of these 9, 4 were sawers and valued at 1,400 pounds, or about 350 each. Elf listed the remaining 5 as joiners and cabinet makers and valued at 2,250 pounds, or about 450 pounds each. That's 9 skilled workers that didn't get paid despite producing thousands of pieces in his shop. For those walking the streets in Charleston in the late 18th century, this would come as no surprise. Alexander Hewitt observed in 1779 that, quote, many Negroes discovered great capacity and an amazing aptness for learning trades, where dangerous tools were used, and many owners, from motives of profit and advantage, breed them to be coopers, carpenters, bricklayers, smiths, and other trades. This trend of cabinet makers using enslaved labor to fulfill orders and meet growing needs is noticeable in newspaper advertisements too. John Nutt, a Charleston cabinet maker, sought a, quote, handy Negro fellow from a local slave owner who would help with his cabinet making business. Nutt also wanted to hire his fellow for by the month or the year. The average length of an apprenticeship for an enslaved African was about 4 years. This is noticeably shorter than the traditional length of an apprenticeship for white craftsmen in the European guild system, which was 7 years. Such training durations suggest that one group's ability to learn the trade faster than other. Or it may suggest the master craftsman knew that enslaved craftsmen were only going to be used the less important parts of a project, so they were not taught. They were taught less than the white apprentices. Hugh Jones stated in 1724 that, quote, a good Negro was sometimes worth 3 or 4 score pounds sterling if he be a tradesman. They are by nature cut out for hard labor and fatigue, and will perform tolerably well, suggesting the shorter apprentice duration means enslaved craftsmen increased in value sooner. There we go, 4-7. Enslaved Africans were often introduced to various trades as apprentices at younger age than white apprentices. Approximately 25% of those enslaved tradesmen whose ages are known are believed to be of an age of typical white apprentices or younger. Newspaper advertisements and apprenticeship contracts use terminology to suggest a younger than normal age, such as boy, lad, and youth. You can see here we've got lad being used, seek an apprentice. Because younger enslaved Africans could spend more of their lives working, they were considered by their owners to be more profitable and therefore more economically valuable. Likewise, an enslaved African who began an apprenticeship sooner began to earn for his owner that much faster. Further, enslaved tradesmen were considered to be more economically valuable than field slaves because the former was able to earn more independently than the latter. As it pertains to this study, white craftsmen could afford to purchase enslaved Africans and begin their apprenticeships or formal training in the trade in order to use the enslaved to accomplish work at an earlier age. Younger enslaved Africans, those who were still children rather than those in later adolescence, were more affordable too. One advertisement in the South Carolina State Gazette and Timothy's Daily Advertiser from 1779 made the pitch that quote, 2 smart black boys apprenticed in house, ship, and cabinet carving could, when free, their profits will be greater to their owner. Thomas Elf documented that at least one of his enslaved craftsmen received formal training as an apprentice. This is Lake, recorded as a carpenter in Elf's account book, quote, allowed William Patterson for Lake when he was an apprentice, £5 16 shillings. Elf regularly hired out his enslaved craftsmen Oxford, George, Liverpool, and Portsmouth to other cabinet makers for various tasks, such as sawing, carpentry, moving and assembling furniture, and painting, to name a few tasks. While traveling through Charleston in 1785, Timothy Ford recorded that, "I have seen tradesmen go through the city followed by a Negro carrying their tools, barbers who are supported in idleness and easy by their Negroes who do the business, and in fact, many of the mechanics bear nothing more of their trade than their name." The extent to which Charlestonians used enslaved craftsmen can be found in the abundant legislation passed by the city beginning at the end of the 17th century. One aspect that many scholars neglect to cite when debating the role of enslaved craftsmen, enslaved community in cabinet-making shops is how the legal system affected the marketplace for enslaved craftsmen, especially between 1764 and 1800. The people of Charleston and the Charleston City Council made it more difficult for enslaved laborers to find work on their own and for slave owners to hire out multiple enslaved craftsmen at any one time. Charleston City Council also passed these laws in order to limit the movement of enslaved Africans in the city. Charlestonians attempted to gain control of the number of enslaved craftsmen openly working and moving throughout the city. During this 36-year period, that is from 1764 to 1800, the city experienced a roller coaster of legal actions that pertained to the use of enslaved and free Africans in Charleston. Each legislative act was an effort to reduce the field of competition between white craftsmen and the enslaved craftsmen that shop owners increasingly relied upon. While 4 different acts were passed during this time, they were not the first of the colony. The earliest Carolina legislation, that from 1690, required slave owners to purchase a ticket for any slave leaving the plantation or heading outside of the owner's shop for the purpose of work or self-employment. Charleston cabinet makers continued to rely upon enslaved craftsmen to meet the demand for fashionable goods despite the laws, as shop owners appeared to have ignored the laws. An update in 1722 reveals the city's attempt to encourage more informers to turn in those enslaved individuals who were breaking the law by rewarding the informant with a 5 shilling per day, with the 5 shilling per day penalty. Charleston cabinet makers and slave owners appeared to be willing to risk the penalty in order to earn additional income from enslaved craftsmen. By March of 1733, the law was clearly being disregarded, and enslaved craftsmen were again hired out by their owners, as evident in this South Carolina Gazette. They quote, that it is common practice by several persons in Charlestown to suffer their Negroes to work out by the week and oblige them to bring in certain hire, which is not only contrary to the law now subsisting, but a great inlet for idleness, drunkenness, and other enormities. In 1751, additional legislation prohibited any enslaved laborer living outside of Charleston city limits from being hired out within the city. Many of the statutes passed by the Charleston City Council in the middle of the 18th century were done so in an effort to regulate the number of slaves imported into the colony and to increase revenue for the city. By limiting the number of enslaved Africans, Charleston City Council hoped that skilled white laborers would be able to find work in the city and that this would further stimulate economic growth. This one, in particular, attempted to curb the number of enslaved and free Africans themselves outside within the city limits, and specifically limited the hiring out of, quote, porters, laborers, fishermen, and handicraftsmen for hire by owners living within the city. By specifying handicraftsmen, Charlestonians argued that the increased number of enslaved craftsmen were making it difficult for white craftsmen to find work, because employers chose enslaved over free labor. The abundance of enslaved labor for hire in the city, approximately 831 enslaved craftsmen trained in skills used in cabinetmaking shops, created an issue for white workers, resulting in a job shortage for free laborers, and preference was given to hiring enslaved workers. Some Charlestonians feared that the use of enslaved and free labor at a lower rate hindered the colony's ability to attract white immigrants, thus making it more difficult for white people to find jobs. Limitation on the number of enslaved Africans an individual could hire out at any one time put a damper on the individual's ability to garner as much possible side income too. This was very likely the motive behind the law, which was quickly ignored by wealthy Charlestonians. 1764 marked a significant year in the use of enslaved craftsmen in Charleston cabinetmaking shops. That year, the slave hire system was again legislated and regulations made stricter by Charleston City Council officials. For the first time, the city required badges and licenses to be carried by the enslaved African hired out, and the supervisor, or the individual responsible for him, was required to produce paperwork for their service. What is especially important about this version of the law was the requirement that enslaved must wear the badge. And this is actually the slave badge we have in our collection here at the DAR Museum. It dates to 1812. Previously, licenses were purchased by the slave owner, but there was no requirement that they be visible on the person and only necessary for viewing when asked. City officials limited the number of slaves permitted to be hired out by one individual, and if violators were caught, these officials faced a penalty of £5 per day. They were exceeding the limitation. The same set of regulations also directed where enslaved laborers could go to find work on their own and how much they could be paid for certain jobs. It was no longer legal for anyone of color, free or enslaved, to go out seeking work as they pleased. An English traveler who called himself the Stranger recorded in 1772 the extent to which the 1764 law lacked enforcement. In August, he wrote, quote, "What regard is paid to this regulation may almost every day be observed in and near the lower market, where constantly resort a great number of loose, idle, and disorderly Negro women, who are seated from morn till night, and buy and sell on their own accounts. For their owners care little how their slaves get the money, so long as they are paid." By ignoring the law, cabinet makers and slave owners allowed enslaved craftsmen to work on jobs that white craftsmen were competing for too. 2 months later, a band of Charlestonians advertised that they were going to take matters into their own hands by putting a stop to this pilfering trade by seizing whatever we shall find in the possession of any slave not having tickets. Citing the 1764 Negro Act, these men, presumably individuals who could not find work because employers chose enslaved labor over free white labor, felt it within their power to operate as law enforcers. The 1764 Act also outlined restrictions that affected enslaved craftsmen. It specified that it was not lawful for the master or owner of any Negro or other slave, whatever, to carry on any mechanic or handicraft trade of themselves in any shop in Charleston. The law also restricted any enslaved African from learning a trade from another enslaved craftsman in Charleston. This mitigated the potential financial harm this could do to the wealthy slave owners in the city. The code stipulated the shop owner. To mitigate the potential financial harm this could do, the wealthy slave owners in the city, and the city code stipulated that shop owners, quote, have and constantly employ one white apprentice or journeyman for every 2 Negroes or other slaves they shall teach and thenceforth employ. But the trend of not following the letter of the law remained intact, for enslaved craftsmen continued to be hired out and other enslaved Africans continued to be apprenticed to a trade. The law remained in effect, so to speak, until the outbreak of the American Revolution. While Charleston witnessed little military presence until late in the war, the laws governing the city did not see drastic change until 1783. That year, Charleston was incorporated as a city, and new laws were enacted, including new, stricter laws pertaining to the use and hire of enslaved craftsmen. Enslaved craftsmen were again required to wear badges, and their owners risked a penalty of £3 for not properly licensing. Any individual who employed an unlicensed enslaved craftsman faced a fine of 20 shillings, or £1, each day the enslaved craftsman was employed. Further, the law set forth the fee to be paid yearly for the license of enslaved craftsmen based on a particular trade. For cabinet makers, that yearly fee for licensing was 40 shillings, or about £2. In 1785, Charleston Cabinetmakers continued to use enslaved craftsmen, and slave owners continued to hire out their enslaved craftsmen without regard to the laws. Noticing a trend here? February 23rd, 1785 edition of the South Carolina Gazette and General Advertiser published the following advertisement. Quote, whereas many persons in the city have neglected to renew their badges for Negroes, which they hire out, this is to acquaint them and others who, contrary to the ordinance of the City Council, hire out Negroes without badges, that unless they call and take out new ones on or before the first day of March next, the law will be strictly put in force against them. The rocky regulations of slaves for hire, in order to create more jobs for white craftsmen and control enslaved Africans movement, continued into the final decades of the 18th century, when, effective on January 1st, 1790, the acts from 1783 and 86 were repealed. For the first time since before the 1783 Negro Act, badges were no longer required. Attempting to regulate and enforce hiring of enslaved and free African craftsmen by the city failed. The hiring of enslaved and free African craftsmen continued through these decades into the 1790s. In 1791, county officials established a universal city and county register office, from where enslaved and free African craftsmen could register and be hired out for work. Such a registry is proof that the demand for skilled enslaved labor was strong in Charleston leading up to the 19th century. This, like most aspects relating to the regulating of enslaved for hire, was slightly hampered only 5 years later, when a 1796 regulation made it unlawful for enslaved craftsmen to hire themselves out for work, and enslaved craftsmen were prohibited from teaching their trade to another enslaved individual. So again, they're going to have a go at trying to regulate this. The final set of regulations that pertain to the hiring of enslaved craftsmen by Charleston Cabinetmakers in the scope of this study came in 1800. In that year, the city passed an ordinance for the better regulation of slaves and for other purposes therein mentioned, which prohibited any such slave, whether male or female, to be employed on hire without a ticket or badge, under a penalty of forfeiting a sum not exceeding $10. Only 11 years after badges were abolished, a law to regulate enslaved craftsmen from being hired on their own time was back on the books. this change was likely due to the success that wealthy Charlestonians found in cotton production in the last decade of the 18th century. With their success came the ability to afford more fashionable goods, which meant the local cabinet makers were looking for enslaved labor to meet new demands. The fee for registering an enslaved craftsman skilled in cabinet making was set at $3 per year. The law specifically required all registered enslaved laborers to, quote, wear the badge received from the city treasurer on some visible part of their dress, and it was now lawful for anyone to approach an enslaved laborer and request to see the badge. This new law also limited the number of enslaved laborers in the city by prohibiting anyone from outside the city limits from acquiring a badge. Based on the extensive legal history surrounding enslaved craftsmen, the abundance of newspaper advertisements and records left by travelers to Charleston, it becomes evident that enslaved craftsmen were an essential part of the success of local cabinet making shops. Though we are quick to associate a piece to a particular shop, new research now allows us the chance to reflect and better understand who was involved in the production. We can now look at an object such as a tea board and know that it was the work of many hands and that those hands were not always the same color.